Welcome to my Hireable background tier list for Legends mod. Just before we get into it, I want to say a big thank you to all of the people who love and support this channel. We just recently hit 700 subscribers, and I'm super thankful that you guys love this content, and I'm really glad that I'm able to get you guys all sorts of stuff, including now a tier list for our Hireable backgrounds. So, before we get into the tier list, I do have to do a quick disclaimer that this list is based on my personal opinion, experience, and the stats from my personal spreadsheet, which you can easily visit on your own time in the description, so please use that as much as you can. I hope it helps as much as it helped people already. My main philosophy is cost-effective stats from reliable backgrounds. It's easy to say just hire Hedge Knights or Gladiators for your entire party, but that isn't realistic on normal playthroughs of the game. This list assumes that you're able to get or are aiming to get favorable stars on the backgrounds you're looking to acquire. Backgrounds included in this list are only ones you can find in any normal run of Battle Brothers Legends mod by either hiring them or finding them through events. Magic backgrounds are not on this list because they've been removed from general gameplay for a while now, and as they're still being worked on. But we will include the 4 new Southern backgrounds that have been added in some of the most recent updates. Which I will mention what update we're up to at the moment in the description and all that. Once this video is up, I'll have the tier list posted on the spreadsheet as well, so you don't have to keep coming and finding the right spot on the video. But I do encourage you to watch the video because we're going to explain why backgrounds are good, why they're not. I'm going to be going into a bit of their cost effectiveness as well. I might put some strong backgrounds in the S tier, but they might be too expensive for you, so we'll go through and explain all the backgrounds, the reasons for their placement, and whether I think they're just worth your cash, because some of them just aren't. So, with that said, this is going to be a long one. The main thing about the tiers, though, before we start, is the S tier, A tier, B tier, C tier, D tier, and E tier are mainly explaining how well they perform in combat, explaining how well their stats are, and how reliant you can be on the brother's performance in any given situation, pretty much. It doesn't include stats. It doesn't include money, which is what I'm going to be explaining myself. With that said, I think it's going to be a long one with 100 backgrounds in total. So let's cut the chatter and get right into it. So first, we're going in alphabetical order to make life a bit easier for me and for you. So we're going into the Adventurer Lady Bow, which is A tier. And I'll put the male version next to it because the Adventurous Lord and the Adventurous Lady Bow version, which is most of these symbols have a bit of annotations on them that I've made myself because some of the symbols look exactly the same, so you won't know exactly what I'm talking about. So if it has a female symbol or an A or an S, that means something different. That's not what you'll find in the game. So we'll just gloss over that quickly and get back to it. The Adventurous Lady and the Adventurous Lord are ranged build characters. They come with a strong range stats and high resolve, which in my opinion is a bit of a waste because ranged brothers don't usually need resolve. They have a little bit of low HP, which can be problematic, but with a bit of luck you can have a dominating brother or just compensate the health with Colossus. So I do recommend them, but they're definitely a bit pricey, which is why I look elsewhere for more cost-effective ranged brothers. So I don't say grab these guys. There's other ranged brothers that I'd go for. So I usually just ignore them unless they're the only ranged brothers I can find on a map. The Adventurous Lady Sword and the Adventurous Noble are also in the A tier. They outperform almost every time. But in all honesty, the sword version of the Adventurous guys, basically, is just better. The melee versions have such strong melee stats with a very high resolve, so you never have to worry about it. You still have the little bit of low HP problem with them, but I definitely recommend grabbing Colossus, and you're basically sorted for most of the time. Their high resolve and high melee stats really allows them to perform a bit more often than I'd say the ranged characters, the ranged brothers here. They are pricey as well, so they're still expensive to grab. But if you get a good melee defense roll, they can even be a strong mind over body build as well, if you like playing with high resolve characters. Not one I always chase because, obviously, of price. But if I had the option between these two, I'd definitely go for the melee one. Now, next on our list is the Alchemist. This is a brand new background from the Southern edition of 4 new backgrounds. And unfortunately, it is C tier. It's got decent melee and range stats if you get lucky, but I cannot recommend it because of the outrageous price that they cost. 2,000 minimum cost for the Alchemist, and they can get even more expensive than that for such unreliable stats. Interestingly enough, though, it has high initiative and is the Southern equivalent to a Herbalist crossed Peddler. So if you want a Herbalist and a Peddler that does a little bit better in stats, you grab an Alchemist, but you know what I mean, for the price, it's not really worth it. One good thing late game, if you really want to go down this path, is you can have cheaper and easier potion crafting when you get to a high level. So if you want to make a build or a party that heavily depends on consumables, but you don't like farming for the consumables, getting a Alchemist will really help you late game because you can get potions made out of a lot easier ingredients to find. I still don't think it's worth it because it's a very high level perk. You need to make sure your potion master lives that long. Unless you're really desperate for that and you really like the 100% bonus to camp crafting, I would just ignore them or go for a taxidermist for the 100% crafting bonus. But yeah, that's the Alchemist there. We'll move on to the Apprentice, and the Apprentice is also C tier. It is a mediocre background that gets a free 10% bonus to experience. It needs some luck with rolls, though, if you want it to be viable in melee. It has worked out for me in the past sometimes, but not always, because you do obviously need a lot of luck for it to be useful. It's only something that I've gone for before because it's cheap. You can constantly roll on them for like $200 and just see if you get a good one every now and again. So it's not too bad, but not too amazing. So we'll just keep it here in C tier. Next on our list is the Arbalester. So there's a lot of backgrounds with this same icon, so we just put an A on it for Arbalester. Now, the Arbalester is a very rare background, and it is our first S tier today. The Arbalester is amazing. Absolutely amazing. It is worth about $2,000, so it's about the same price as these guys or the Alchemist. Sometimes these guys can be a little more expensive. But for about $2,000, you get amazing stats for practically every situation. It says Arbalester, and that's what the background is, but they've got great melee stats, great range stats, viable in almost every build you want to make. They have a little bit low HP sometimes if you're unlucky, but the main downside is they're super rare. You're almost never going to see one. You have to be super lucky, go through citadels, I think it is, the strongholds. You'll only really find them there, and events can really help you find them, but they're just rare as heck. But their stats are amazing. So if you ever find one, just pick it up. Don't even worry about almost the stars even. They're just great. Okay, so the Assassin event and the Assassin Southern are next on our list. So we'll do them together just because they're very similar. They're both A tier. So the Assassin event is the one you get from having a bastard in your party and having the event when he's like level 9, level 10. I have it written down. But the Southern Assassin's one you can pick up anytime you want. And between them, their stats are very similar, but the only thing that's different is you can pick up a Southern Assassin a lot easier than you can pick up the Assassin from the event. So I always recommend going for the Southern one instead. They're very strong, as is the event, but we'll just talk for both of them. They're both very strong backgrounds. They can be a bit costly or hard to find. They don't need much luck to be useful, but you can get a little low on the HP and fatigue if you're unlucky. They're very good in melee. One of the best backgrounds for a dodge or a fencer build because they've got one of the highest initiatives available to backgrounds. If you have a couple grand spare, just like these guys, definitely go for it if you really want a reliable fencer. So I highly recommend the Southern Assassin, or the Hashassin, or Hashassin. I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, that's why I call it the Southern Assassin. Anyways, moving on to the Beggar. Beggar is C tier. It's another mediocre background like the Apprentice. It stands out with a bit of higher fatigue, though, which is interesting. It is also very cheap. It can be a decent melee pickup, but you do obviously need the luck. It's just average, and it can roll high, it can roll low. It's just another cheap basic background that you can pick up if you need a body, basically. So nothing too special about it, except for a little bit of high fatigue. Barbarian event. So the Barbarian is an A tier for sure. You get it from an event that can be has a cooldown of 60 days. It is a rare event, so it's not like it's going to happen very often in your runs and you need to be up in the northern part of the map. But it's great melee stats all around, and even if you roll low on the stats, it can still be pretty decent. So you don't have to worry about picking up a bad one, basically. The defenses are the thing that really holds it back a little bit. It can be a little low on the defenses, can roll like a C tier in terms of defenses, but every other stat that they have is good. Their daily wage is also very expensive. If you've seen our runs before and our playthroughs, they will bleed you through for money. But I'm always happy to have one in my party, especially since you get them for free. So you just get a free brother with lovely stats. It's just a small price to pay for a free background with very reliable melee stats, so highly recommend it. The Bastard is next. Now, the Bastard is our first B tier today. Strong melee attack, but can have rather low resolve and defenses. If you win the 50-50 and get good resolve and defenses, which, you could lose the 50-50 as well, the Bastard could be a strong but rather costly background for how unreliable its stats can be. It is the gateway background, as I've mentioned, for getting the Event Assassin in a normal run after reaching level 10, that's right. However, I just cut out the middleman and spend money on the Southern Assassin instead if you're wanting to get this Event Assassin, as it's better and you can level it earlier on immediately. The Bastard is not a background I ever really care about, and I don't think I've hired one in a very long time. They're just really not worth it. The stats-wise, though, they are B tier, but personally, not my cup of tea for the amount of money you have to pay for it. Next up is our Beast Slayer. Beast Slayer is B tier. It is a good background in terms of stats, good overall ranged and melee stats. As long as you ignore its lower defenses, you don't need too much luck to be strong melee, ranged, or even a hybrid brother, because the Beast Slayer is one of those backgrounds that can be viable for hybrids, if you like hybrids. The high price, though, does turn me away a little bit, and I usually roll on brothers that are good at one thing or have better defenses, because I don't use hybrids very much personally, so the Beast Slayer doesn't usually come into my party that often, but still a good option if you have the money for it. Now, next on our list is the Beggar. Very cheap and useless stats, and that's why it is D tier. When you're desperate, go for a Beggar. And even then, don't. The rarest occasion, they'll have a decent melee stat if they roll high. But overall, just not worth it. They're cheap and just stats you don't want on a brother. If you have the same amount of money, you might be able to get a cheap C tier instead. So just go for C tiers if you want a body on the field. Don't go for the Beggar. Just not worth it. The Belly Dancer is next on our list, and it's only found in an event, and it is A tier quality indeed. Outperforms almost every time. Good overall melee attack. Just that's the main thing it's got going for it. But it can have a little bit low HP, a little bit low resolve. But you're spending $500 on a brother that has very capable melee stats in general. It could be benefiting from a little bit defensive luck, but in general, on average rolls, you've got a very nice brother for $500. And it's well worth the price, and I'm rarely disappointed whenever I pick up a Belly Dancer in my party. So yeah, definitely a spot on my team every time I do a run. And every time I'm in the Southern Lands, basically. So definitely a thumbs up for me. We're going next into the Berserker from the event. Now, Berserker is S tier for sure. Absolute dominating background. It's very hard to grab a Berserker in a normal run of Battle Brothers. It comes from a hard to get legendary quest that is also just, if you can finish the quest, that's the harder part as well, not just finding the quest. You are greatly rewarded, though, from going through all the efforts of getting the quest and finishing it with an amazingly strong background for melee builds. Basically, it can outperform almost any other background on this list. It'll compete with S tiers for sure, but completely destroy any other backgrounds in terms of melee prowess. And you technically get him for free after working so hard for him. And can even do well barehanded as well. So if you like barehanded builds, the Berserker is like king of the barehanded as well. A superb background if you can get him. Next is the Blacksmith. The Blacksmith is B tier. Now, that's mainly for his stats-wise, but in general, he is a must-have in your party nowadays because he is a gateway to late-game crafting for most armors and equipment that are very strong. You'll need a blacksmith in order to make them. So almost every party will have a blacksmith because that's a gateway you have to get through it. But in terms of having him perform on your team in combat, he can use a little bit of luck, but he can still be pretty good. Usually the defenses are pretty crap, so you kind of want to build them as a polearm because of also their low resolve as well. They can get lucky with melee attack, but if you're really, really unlucky in general, you can just use them as somebody who sits in your back line that does nothing and has a nice, beautiful benefit to 20% reduced tool consumption. They have a high repair rate, a high salvage rate, and a high crafting speed whilst you're camping. Their insanely high expensive upfront cost was also reduced a little while ago, making it a lot easier to grab one without needing to be super rich. Normally you'd have to spend like $6,000 to grab one of these things, and recently I've seen some for maybe like 600 as well, so maybe like a few grand down to 600. So definitely a big thumbs up, but if you want him to perform well in melee, might need a bit of luck. Next on our list is the Bowyer, which is got a B because there's a different one. The Bowyer is B tier for ranged characters. You've got decent range stats for a decent price, I guess, but I usually prefer other backgrounds, namely the Hunter. But you can get some good average stats with the Bowyer if you get a bit of luck. If you're not really lucky, you still have some decent stats as well. If you're not wealthy enough to go for any expensive ranged brothers, I'd recommend them. You can also just consider getting like poachers and shepherds and stuff like that. But in all intents and purposes, you can get a really good brother out of a Bowyer. So thumbs up for me, but I usually hunt for different ones. Next on our list is the Brawler, B tier for sure. Cheap up front, but costly per day wage. Not insanely costly, but compared to C tiers and stuff, you will be paying a bit more for his per day wage. Can roll well for most melee builds. Definitely a more reliable background that can perform well in melee. But just be careful, Brawlers can have a bit of weak defense if you roll bad. But be prepared to low roll it. I don't always expect my Brawlers to come up with a really good defense. It is interesting that the Brawler got buffed to have a plus 21 to your stash limit. So you're basically your equipment and your food and everything. You get plus 21 slots just by hiring a Brawler. So that's just another reason to grab one today, basically. Lovely background. Butcher is also B tier. I'd say it's basically a slightly weaker Brawler that can have like maybe 1 or 2 extra points in melee attack on average. In general, I choose Brawlers over Butchers, so I'd put it a bit lower on the B tier if we actually did between the lists ranking. But they do have a cheap cost, and they are a bit reliable with their melee attack. So they can also be your party cook as well. So if you need a cook and you want them to be viable in melee, grab a Butcher. Next on our list is the Cannibal that you can get from an event only. E tier. Practically useless. Don't grab it. They've got mediocre melee stats if you're desperate. But definitely be warned. Cannibals are horrible. I don't touch them with a 10-foot pole because they can give permanent injuries to your other brothers from events. They can just chop other people's legs off. They can nibble their ears off and do stupid stuff. If you get it to level 3 just to unlock the cook retinue, because it is a cook like the butcher, and you haven't found a butcher in your entire run, I mean, you can tamper with a bit of risk and get yourself a cook on your team, but, you know, I don't find it worth it personally. The only benefit that I've heard from other people is if you're doing long, big fights in the wilderness late game, and you're struggling to keep on top of food, which can be difficult in large parties, and you fight humanoids, you can get a bunch of strange meat by having a cannibal in your party. You can draw the line as to how that happens, but, you know, other than that, I really just think they're practically useless. So, no. Next on our list is the Caravan Hand. It is a C tier, in my eyes, and in stats-wise as well. They have mediocre melee stats with potential with a bit of luck. However, you can get some low rolls and be completely disappointed with your purchase. They're like $500 roughly, and if you're spending that kind of money, you sort of want a bit more reliability with what you're getting. And I have a bunch of other backgrounds in the back of my mind when I'm spending around $500 and going, you know what? I could get a bit more value for my money not going for a Caravan Hand. They are top of the C tier if you're trying to think of in-between C tier choices in terms of stats. But, I mean, with that kind of money, you can spend cheaper money for a B tier or the same amount of money in a B tier and it's better. So, not my preferred, but in terms of stats, top of the C tier. Next on our list is the Converted Crusader Crisis event. This is our first background that is found in Crises only, and this one's from the Holy Crisis. The Converted Crusader is a straight A tier in terms of stats. I have not personally ever gotten one because I've never been lucky enough to get the event happening, but in the Holy War, if you're out in the middle of the desert, you can find a Converted Crusader who will join you for free. The stats are very good in terms of melee stats. And you get it for free also at level 3. I think it is level 3 or just a few extra free levels whenever you grab him. So he comes a bit wounded to your party, but you get some free levels. So it's just really nice. So I definitely recommend keeping it when you get one because they're worth it. Or hunting for one if you're doing the Holy War Crisis. Maybe spend a bit of time in the desert. Get yourself a free A tier background for sure. Next on our list is the Cripple. Practically useless. The Cripple has the worst stats statistically of any background in the entire game, including all of the Legends backgrounds as well. The only time I ever even look at a Cripple is going in Cultist runs, basically. They're used as cheap cannon fodder and cheap event fodder, basically. So when you have a Cultist run and you axe off your weakest brothers and sacrifice them to Davkul, I just sacrifice Cripples because it makes life easier. Other than that, if you want a body on the field, for that kind of cheap money, you can grab Ds and C tiers for sure. They're just not worth it. They'll die in like one hit. They're so weak. Anyways, moving on from the Cripple, we are grabbing ourselves a Cultist next. And Cultists are B tier. Cultists hold a special place in my recruit selection because they have such high potential for such a cheap cost. However, they can also roll really low, so I am prepared for that. They are great resolve for a banner, but if you're lucky, they can be almost anything in your party. Ranged, melee, maybe even defensive if you get lucky on defense as well, and maybe a mind over body build, whatever you want. Cultists have all the potential. They can usually be very cheap up front and per day, so you don't have to worry about paying for them, even in the long run. Though, I always roll on their stats because I love them, but I'm always ready to be disappointed, because you really are just playing the lotto when you come for a cultist. But I still do it anyways because I know they have the potential to be a lot better than C tiers, and sometimes even B tiers if you're lucky too. So the cost of it makes it super effective, and a big thumbs up in my books. Now, next on the list is Daytaler. D tier. Not the bottom of the barrel, but it's pretty close. Once in a blue moon, a good Daytaler is born, but don't hold your breath. It's a cheap body on the field, but just go buy a cheaper C tier instead. Kind of like the Beggar, just don't, if you don't have to, don't buy them. Not recommended. The Dervish. It is a new southern background. That's our second one on the list. And it is sadly C tier as well. The new backgrounds aren't doing super fancy things for me, and I'm not recommending them very much. The Dervish is decent enough with resolve, so it's kind of like a cultist, but unfortunately it's a lot more expensive. The main thing that you'd ever want to look at a Dervish for is basically somebody with really high resolve and someone with really high health. Basically one of the highest health backgrounds ever, basically, in your entire roster, entire background selection. They always come with the tough trait, which is the plus 10 health trait. Basically, it's a southern cultist with varied stats that are expensive. Just go with something else, in my opinion. I mean, they can survive a bit longer than your normal resolve brother, but for the cost it is, it's just not worth it. Next is the Deserter. Now, the Deserter is B tier in terms of stats. I place it higher than you'd normally expect a Deserter to be placed, mainly because their overall stats are good. Just in general, like, you can have good melee stats on a Deserter. The only thing that really draws people away from it, and myself included, I don't ignore this fact, but Deserters have abysmal, the worst resolve you'll ever see on any brother in the game. So don't leave them in your front lines. But don't forget about their melee stats. They actually could become a good polearm brother for you. A good reach weapon user. Definitely useful. As long as you got good stars with them, a backliner Deserter can definitely be worth it in your party, because they're not badly priced either. You know, I was saying about where I'd spend $500. I'd rather spend $500 on a Deserter than a Caravan Hand for sure. I mean, you're getting reliable stats that you can actually guarantee a good brother, as long as you have space in your backline for them. Definitely an option to go for. So yeah, nice little thumbs up there. Next on the list, I'll do these together. The Disowned Noble and the Disowned Noblewoman. Sadly, C tier. Just sadly. They've got strong, reliable melee attack, but the rest of the kit, you just need so much luck for them to be useful. They just aren't useful. Maybe if you're wanting to have like a polearm brother, but you're spending so much money as well. They're like $1,000 minimum. And for C tier level of stats, I just can't recommend them. You're paying too much for something that needs too much luck. That's just it for me. So I look elsewhere when it comes to the Disowned Woman and the Disowned Noble. Because, yeah, just not worth it. Now, next on our list is the Eunuch. The Eunuch is D tier, sadly. I'd love the Eunuch to have more stats. It's got such a cool, unique ability to never be able to be charmed by hexes, because, you know, obviously. They can't be charmed by hexes, which is cool and fun, but because they don't have good stats, they're just not worth it. They're cheap, though, so if you want to play around and have, like, an entire party, go hex hunting and all that kind of stuff, sure. Sounds fun, but unfortunately, the stats just aren't there. So, unless you're desperate, go for a fun Eunuch, but don't pay them too much attention. The Farmhand. Farmhand is C tier. decent melee background with high HP and fatigue. That's basically what's going for the farmhand. But in order for it to be useful in the melee attack, melee defense, and all that, you're going to have a bit of luck. Survivability is a good thing, but you won't have the attack to keep up with the rest of your brothers, or to keep up with late game either. So you can also have a bit of low resolve too if you're unlucky. It's not a bad C tier, but sometimes I've seen some farmers go for really high prices and just don't do it. It's not worth it. Unless you find a cheap one with good stats, farmers are not the best ones to cycle through because they can be a bit expensive with whatever they're wearing and all that as well. And that sort of segues into our next one as well. We've got the Fisherman, who is a slightly weaker farmhand in terms of health and fatigue, a little bit more reliable with resolve. So that's sort of the way they compare to each other in the C tier. So if you're wanting a bit more health and fatigue, go for the farmer. If you want a bit more resolve, go for the Fisherman. But as usual with the C tiers, you're just not going to have enough luck to have reliable stats in melee attack, melee defense. It's just not going to be performing as well in melee. The Fishmonger is the female version of the Fisherman, also C tier, and almost identical stats to the Fisherman. So these three, I can sort of band them together as mediocre stats with decent health and decent fatigue. But you're going to have to keep rolling on them and getting lucky with just all their other stats. So unless you got the money to constantly cycle through them, I wouldn't recommend it too much. But yes, the other thing is the Fisherman can also be a little pricey, as well as the farmhands. So they can get up to like the $700, $800 mark, and then you're going, that's not even worth it. If you really want, though, I'd recommend the Fishmonger out of all of them, the female version. The Fishmonger's price is really low usually. They're like $250. So if you want average stats, go for an Apprentice, Fishmonger, stuff like that. Nice, cheap, that you can cycle through them and maybe find a good one. But these two are just a bit too expensive. Okay, so moving on from the C tier groups, we're going into the Flagellant, which unfortunately is still C tier. But it's C tier for a different reason. Alright, the Flagellant is usually very cheap, so you don't have to worry about them often, though on rare occasions I have seen them for like $1,000. So, you know, take it with a bit of grain of salt. But depending on what they're wearing, they're usually very cheap, which have moderate melee stats, so you do need a bit of luck. But they've got good resolve, so if you're looking for like a banner, or maybe a mind over body build, maybe look after the Flagellant. But because they need too much luck, I go hunting for things like Cultists. Cultists are nice and cheap all the time. You're going to be able to get some really high, nice rolls on a Cultist. It'll outperform a Flagellant for sure. If you want really good stats, maybe go for a Dervish if you have the extra coin, and they can definitely outperform a Flagellant. So yeah, there's just usually better options for a Flagellant. That's why it's on C tier in terms of stats. And that's why it's C tier in my books. It's just not a resolve brother that I usually pick up or cycle for. So that's that. Next up is the Fletcher. So the Fletcher is basically the same as the Bowyer. I think it's the female version. I can't remember which one's the female version or not. But the Fletcher, just practically identical stats. It's not a background I hunt usually, but if you don't have much range on your map, go for a Fletcher. They will perform well. They don't need too much luck. But I usually hunt for things like hunters and stuff, because I'm a bit more specific with the way I hunt my ranged characters. But I can still recommend the Fletcher and the Bowyer as decent for a little bit of price, but they're decent. The Foot Soldier is next on our list, and it is S tier. It is a very rare background, just like the Arbalester, and as you can see it shares the same fists, so you just have to figure out in game, put your mouse over it, it'll tell you which one it is. It's very strong all-rounder in terms of melee stats. It's a little different to the Arbalester because no backgrounds are going to be exactly the same. They're going to be slightly different. Even the males and female versions are going to be only a little bit off in terms of their stats, but I group them together because they're close. With the Arbalester and the Foot Soldier, they're rather different. The Arbalester is got great range stats with some good melee stats. The Foot Soldier has some good melee stats with good defense. So the defense is really what stands out in a Foot Soldier. They're not something crazy like a Shield Maiden, but they do have really good defense, and they're worth $2,000 as well for like the Arbalest or the Foot Soldier. If you got $2,000, just insta buy it. Yeah, they're totally worth it. S tier, always exceptional and strong. Anywhere you put them in a melee build, you're just going to be super happy for picking one up for your party. So if you ever find one, they're super rare, as well as the Arbalester. That seems to be quite the trend, and you'll see the trend continue for the S tiers. Rare, hard to get, super great stats. Citadels and Strongholds, I believe, is the same place to find the Arbalester and the Foot Soldier. It's going to take you a while to find one, but definitely going to be happy when you see one. Next up is the Gambler. Gambler is B tier. Personally prefer Cultists, basically, but I still do grab Gamblers whenever I can't get enough Cultists, or can't get a good Cultist, basically. Gamblers have really good resolve. They're better than Flagellants, so just grab a Gambler instead of a Flagellant. Grab a Cultist instead of a Flagellant. It's just totally worth it. Their bonus to range defense, though, is a really nice little bonus as well. If they're not being super defensive in your back line, they have the free range defense to survive, or just make your the enemy archers shoot something else. So they're usually reasonable priced, and can have some decent melee attack if you get lucky, but don't bet your money on it. If you're lucky with a melee attack, just be really happy with it, but don't expect them to perform super well in melee. Just buy one for getting a good banner in your party. That's usually all the Gambler's worth. The Gladiator is our next one, and it is S tier. Super strong melee attacks. Not the best melee attacks and melee defense and stats in the game, but they're very, very strong. As usual, with really good stats, you're going to have to pay through the nose. The Gladiator is insanely expensive up front and per day. I usually avoid them because I don't have the coin to fork out all those stats, and I'd usually just like to roll for them and have more fun with other types of backgrounds. I like trying to make more cost-effective backgrounds work well. But if you're super rich, grab a Gladiator. They're usually not too hard to find down in the south, and their stats are always good. So definitely an exceptionally strong melee builded background for you. The Gravedigger is a C tier. Just average melee stats overall. They're very cheap usually, so you can cycle through them quite easily. The main problem you're going to have with the Gravedigger is the luck on your melee attack. Their other stats aren't too bad, but you're probably going to roll low on their melee attack every now and again. So, don't hold your breath. Not too fancy. They are decent C tier for a decent cheap price, so one of the ones I'd recommend if you're trying to cycle through. But, yeah. Got to get a bit of luck. Next is the Grave Robber. The Grave Robber is basically a better version of the Gravedigger, but as usual, you're going to have to pay for it. Gravedigger's cheap, Grave Robber is mediocre in its price. It's about 500 to 1,000 depending on what they're wearing. They are pretty cool. They're the only background that I remember that can come with rare skeleton weapons and ancient weapons. So you can get them equipped quite nicely, though, for a pretty decent price. So I do recommend going for the Grave Robber over the C tiers, if you can. Their stats are just a little bit more reliable. And yeah, you don't have to worry about equipping them half the time either. So a bit of a thumbs up for me in that book. And yeah, just reliable. Next on our list is the Hedge Knight. S tier for sure. Most of you who play the game know that Hedge Knights are just dominating. If you grab one, that's basically the pinnacle of vanilla gameplay. almost the pinnacle. Like, there's one other that you guys already know. But the Hedge Knight is a very strong melee background that practically doesn't need enemy luck to be good stats-wise. But you are going to pay a lot for them, as you know. They're very expensive up front and per day, just like the Gladiator. They're like the Northern Gladiator, as the Gladiator came second, so the Gladiator is like a Southern Hedge Knight. The only thing I don't like about Hedge Knights is you're paying through the nose for great stats, but their melee defense is actually a bit low. When it comes to looking at other S tiers, like Gladiators and stuff, if you spend the same money on a Gladiator and a Hedge Knight, the Gladiator is going to give you a little bit more stats for your money in terms of defense. And defense is a hard stat to come by in most backgrounds. So I'd slightly recommend the Gladiator over the Hedge Knight if you have that kind of money to spend. But that's just my personal opinion there. And I personally just go for the cheaper ones anyways, because I don't usually have the crazy amount of money to spend on them. Next up is our Herbalist / Apothecary's background. C tier. It's very mediocre in terms of stats. The main reason why you would want to pick up one is they've got great benefits to medical supplies and healing. But if you're wanting somebody to come and fight in combat, survive, kill a bunch of enemies for you, you are not going to be happy with your purchase. They can get lucky with stats, as with all the C tiers. But usually you just want to sit in the background, have Peaceable on, make sure they don't fight too much. They can allow you late game to craft cheaper medicines for your party. Kind of like the Apothecary can... Not the Apothecary, the Alchemist can get you cheaper potion crafting at the end of the game. The Herbalist Apothecaries can get you cheaper medicine crafting. And it gives you a 100% boost to gathering medical supplies whilst you're camping as well. So having one in your party is nice. I don't always need one, but I can still recommend that it's a nice background to have just sitting around doing nothing in your party if you can afford the body that just does nothing. But helps keep your other guys healed up quickly. Anyways, C tier in terms of stats, and not too expensive usually. Next up is our Historian. D tier. Sadly, a background that doesn't have the stats to become viable in melee or ranged. I don't recommend this, unless you're super desperate for a body on the field, but even then, go C tier. The only real benefit to having a Historian in your party is if you're farming for scrolls through southern locations and the library and all that, or trying to make your own scrolls. They have the ability to decipher scrolls as one of their perks. They are cheap overall, so they're a cheap way to get that perk if you can keep them up to the level that they need to grab it. But in general, just not worth grabbing Historian at all. So I can't recommend them. Next up is our Holy Crusader, our next Crisis event character from the Undead Crisis. S tier for sure. Our last Crisis was A tier, which was the converted Crusader from the Holy War. But this time, we've got the Holy Crusader, and this background is a beast. You get him for free, and he will just insanely perform every time in melee. Especially during the Undead Crisis. The Holy Crusader gets plus 10 bonus melee attack against all undead. So if you're trying to farm undead, just go crazy and grab him for free. On the lowest rolls, the Holy Crusader can still outperform almost any background in the A, B, C tier. They do amazing. They also have very high resolve, which allows you to do a lot of mind over body builds as well. Their initiative is garbage, but usually that doesn't matter on your frontliners. So other than that, that's just amazing. I'm always happy to have the Undead event happen, the Undead Crisis, and I'm always happy to grab this guy in my party because it's such a free beast of a brother. Houndmaster is next, and it's a B tier. The Houndmaster is pretty decent, and for a reasonable price too, so I do recommend grabbing one. They do need a little luck, as usual, but they don't need too much luck. Their melee stats are pretty good, but the only thing is you can sometimes get a few low rolls and then be sad with your purchase. But more often than not, you'll be happy with what you grab, and you'll get yourself a decent background, a decent brother that has really cool perks for dog bonuses. So you can get confident on dogs. You can start breeding dogs in your party. So definitely a background I can recommend as a good solid B tier to grab for your party for a decent price. Next up is our housemaid, which sadly is D tier. Just another background with not enough stats. More often than not, you'll just throw it away and be very unhappy with your purchase. They're very cheap, as always, as most of the Cs and Ds are. Just cheap, but not worth it. They're unreliable, they're weak, they don't have good defense, no good attack, not a good stat to really boast about. And yeah, you just have better ways to spend your money and to have someone on the field. Next up is our hunter. S tier for sure. Hunters are amazing ranged brothers. They can be a little pricey from about $1,000 to $2,500, but they are well worth the cost in my opinion. And they're usually not too hard to find on most maps. They have one of the highest range stats in the entire game across all backgrounds, and that includes things like your other S tiers and all your A tiers. They have one of the highest range stats in the game, and the only character that beats them in it is Master Archers, which, if you've seen them before, I mean, being second best to a Master Archer is a good thing. They can roll a little low on the health if you're unlucky with hunters, but that's not something you usually have to worry about. When I have money, and when I'm hunting for ranged brothers, I always save up for hunters. I always go hunting for hunters. They are the cheapest top tier range unit. If you're spending $1,000 to $2,500 for a brother that will work out, you're doing well. If I don't have the money for hunters and I just need a ranged brother on the field, or if I'm struggling, I'll go for things like poachers, shepherds, maybe a Fletcher or a Bowyer, because they're all pretty decent. But definitely I recommend saving up your cash and going around for hunters, because they're absolutely amazing. Now, next on the list is Indebteds. Indebted are E tier. Practically useless, in my opinion, and even stats-wise. Their stats are a bit under average. They're not really amazing in any situation. The only cool thing they have is you don't have to pay them per day. They're slaves. Once you buy them, they just stick with you forever for no cost. So on paper and up front, it looks great. You're spending 200 something bucks for a brother that costs nothing per day. The only thing you have to do is just feed him and he'll be happy. But, you go to like a baker that can cost like 100 to 150 bucks. You go to a fishmonger, which is about 250. You can even get like beggars for 100, daytalers for something like that. You're spending 200 something bucks on a brother that only goes to maximum level 7. So they're going to be completely useless late game, even as cannon fodder. Like, you think logically, in terms of defense stats, 4 extra levels from level 7 to level 11, 4 extra levels of defense on any of the C tiers or D tiers is just worth so much more than just having the indebted not cost anything per day. So I really just don't recommend them in any situation. Use C tiers and D tiers for cannon fodder. Use them for front lines that you throw away. They'll give you so much more value, even if you're having to spend them for how long they live, like a few bucks a day. The Indebted is just not worth it in my books. I don't recommend them. If you guys like Indebted, please let me know. But I don't see a use for them at all. And their stats are just not that great either. Like, to be maxing out at level 7, there should be at least something else better than them not costing anything a day. But that's my little rant about Indebted. They're just practically useless. Okay, moving on to the Inventor. The Inventor is D tier. weirdly enough. I'm a bit controversial on this. I don't think the inventor's good. They're overpriced, and they're just overrated. They have mediocre stats, so they've got like C tier level of stats-ish, but they cost over $1,000. At least. They're so expensive. The only major positive that people like having them for in a party is they can reduce the effects of permanent injuries by creating prosthetics. So if one brother lost his hand, they can create a prosthetic hand. But the major catches, and the reason why it's so just painful to have one, is that the prosthetic is an event-based thing. You don't craft it in your camp. You don't buy it. It comes through an event. It's also locked behind a perk at level 9. So you need this $1,000 plus inventor to survive to level 9, get this perk, which will then start making you roll on the event tables, which is super rare to begin with as well. And even when you do get it, you're probably not going to be able to choose... No, you're not probably. It's a random one. So you're not even going to be able to choose which permanent injury you fix. It's not going to be fixed to perfection. It still counts as a permanent injury. And your brother's still going to be struggling. It can help partially revive brothers that are down on their luck in your party, but don't get your hopes on it happening anytime soon, on the injury you want or as good as you want. The only other small thing that they have going for them is they can also decipher scrolls like the Historian. At least in that way, if you want a good scroll person in your party, they're a little bit more useful than Historians in terms of stats and everything else, but obviously they're a bit more expensive too. Not a background I ever really spend money on or ever really recommend. So sadly, just if you're desperate for scrolls or you're desperate for slightly better permanent injuries in the next 100+ days, because it'll take you forever to get one of those events to roll, when you're desperate, maybe get an inventor. But yeah, that's about it. Moving along, we're going to the Ironmonger next, which is C tier. The Ironmonger has slightly above average melee stats. They've got good HP, but I just can't put them into B rank. I want to, but I can't, because they're not as reliable as I want them to be. You need a bit of melee attack and defense luck in order for them to be good. I'd say they're top of the C tier in terms of stats, and they're actually a pretty decent price tag too. If you want to compare them with Caravan Hands, I'd say they're just a little bit better. They'd probably be the best C tier you could probably grab. But if you have that kind of money, they're about, I don't know, $300-ish. You can still roll on things like Brawlers, Butchers, Cultists, and a few others maybe if you're lucky on the price tag. But if you're trying to roll for some C tiers, definitely Ironmonger's a decent choice to choose, and one that I would recommend. Next up is the Juggler. Now, if you've watched my playthroughs, you know I love Jugglers. I think they're an underrated gem. Because they only have mediocre-ish, average-ish stats, but I personally rate them higher than a C rank because they have an extra 10% chance to hit the head just for free, and they also come with a hair splitter perk which gives them 30% chance to hit the head as well. It allows you to create brothers that can just destroy helmets and kill enemies without having to worry about their shields if you use flails, or if you use one-handed axes, you can just demolish heads. I think the Juggler is just amazing. If you get some luck, they can be a really strong melee brother. Or, in rare occasions, you can also get some really lucky high-ranged rolls as well. And maybe put them as like a throwing weapon brother, because usually they're a decent price to pay for a Juggler. But I must say, if they are wielding some expensive weapons, or that too many of their hats and stuff, they can be a little expensive. So, you know, it's a bit of a jump to the price. So play with a grain of salt there. Their resolve and their HP can be a little low sometimes, so usually you might want to have them as a backliner. But I do usually roll on them just to try and get lucky on them to make an amazing headhunting brother. But that's that. Killer on the Run is next. Also a B tier. Underrated stats-wise because they actually have above average stats, and I think they're really good. They have a 10% chance to hit the head just like the Juggler, but they don't get Hair Splitter. So you can't make them into a headhunting demon, basically. They can roll Resolve a little bit low, but if you get past their slightly low Resolve, they have great melee stats in general with a bit of luck. They do have a negative event that can have authorities track them down. A 50-50 chance to have you not fight them, which is really nice. But they can be a little risky, but even with the risks, I do like picking up Killer on the Runs because they've got just above average stats that are very decent. As long as you have the stars like you would want to have with any other brother, they're actually generally good B tiers. Next up is the King's Guard event. A tier for sure. The King's Guard is a background that has solid melee stats, but you can only grab it once a playthrough from an event that is pretty rare. Now, once you do get the King's Guard, he doesn't look like this. He looks like a cripple. But he has the flavor text in his description that he's a King's Guard. So don't get confused. That's not a cripple you've picked up. You've actually picked up this amazing background. But you have to babysit that cripple for 30 days until he gets his buffs. I believe that the King's Guard is top tier material, but you need the luck to grab him in the first place. Then you need to keep a cripple for 30 days living. You can't let him die. So, I mean, if you have all that patience, and you have a party that can keep a cripple alive, he can be worth it, for sure. Especially if he rolls high. If he rolls high, it's a dominating brother. If he rolls low, then he's just like a B or C tier in terms of his low rolls. But almost every time he will outperform. So I recommend the King's Guard when you can get him. The Lumberjack is a B tier. Definitely solid stats that can be effective with some good rolls. High HP and fatigue is nice to have. And with a bit of luck, you've got a solid melee brother in your lineup for a mostly decent price. Sometimes, though, Lumberjacks can be a little too expensive for my liking. So I only check out the cheap ones. Sometimes they can be like $1,000 for a Lumberjack, and I really don't think that's worth your money. If they're more closer to like 500 or so, or even less if you're really lucky, yeah, go for the cheaper Lumberjacks. Don't waste it on the big ones. Spend your money elsewhere. But if you get some cheap ones, they can get pretty lucky. The Manhunter is next. I absolutely love the Manhunter. A tier for sure. Stats in all the right places for roughly about $1,000. That's usually how much I pay for them. I try and buy ones that are under 1,000 if I can. 700, 800, 900 roughly. You have a powerhouse melee in the making that really doesn't need much stats to outperform almost any other background below it. Or even in the A tiers. It can sometimes outperform A tiers if you get some good rolls. But as long as I have the cash, I definitely check them out, because they can be so good in melee and will be a good addition to your lineup. So a big tick for me for Manhunters. I love them to bits. Next up is our Mason. C tier, sadly. It's just an average brother for pretty cheap. But as usual, you just need lots of luck with the defense and the attack. Because they are cheap, you can roll through them. I think they're like an Apprentice. They get a bit of bonus to their learning, I think they do. But yeah, it's not super special, but you can just keep rolling through them like C tiers for pretty cheap. So if you like that, go for it. The Master Archer is next on the list, and the name says it all. It is a Master of Archers. Absolute king amongst ranged brothers. It outperforms literally every other ranged background in the game. Being the most expensive brother as well, with prices between $15,000 and $25,000, you would expect it to perform well. However, I rarely recommend you to ever purchase this background, after saying it is absolutely amazing. Because you can easily pick up 10 hunters for the same price of one Master Archer, and have 10 second best brothers in the game shooting at your opponents. Even though the stats are really close. You're only losing like 5 ranged attack or something. Not even. Barely losing any differences between the Hunter and the Master Archer. But even so, the Master Archer is still super dominating. If you don't have room in your party and you have tons of money and you just need a couple of really good archers, you might as well go for the best. The Master Archer also gives your party 25% movement speed bonus through forests, and also raises your maximum ammo stash by 55 with just one character. You can zip through forests and have so much extra spare ammo in your party. But still, in my opinion, just go with hunters. The Master Archer is way too expensive and way too rare. Just get a hunter. Okay, so Messenger is up next. C tier. Oops, goes there. The Messenger is a diamond in the rough because of the amazing movement speed buffs you also get. Just like the Master Archer, but not as amazing. You get movement speed buffs in almost every terrain with the Messenger. Up to maybe like 4, 5, even 8%, something like that. If you get lucky with the rolls in the melee stats, you can have a decent combat brother. But I'm not patient enough to cycle through messengers to find a good one because you need a bit of luck. They are fairly cheap though, so like the Ironmonger, like the Mason, like the Apprentice, you can get some really decent ones if you have enough time to cycle through them. But even if you don't get a good one, you can have a brother that helps you run from your enemies, because you get that nice overworld movement speed buff on most situations and most terrains. So, a maybe in my books. A maybe. Situationally. Militia is next, and a background I absolutely love having in my party. A tier for sure. I absolutely love Militia, and I will vouch for it till I die. It is a very rare occasion to roll a bad Militia. And when you do roll a bad Militia, it'll probably be because of a low HP or resolve roll, and even then, you're usually not too upset with those rolls. Other than that, the price tag is sometimes steep depending on what they're wearing, so I usually don't hunt the really big ones, like 1,000, 2,000 costs. I don't want to be spending too much on a Militia. If you're lucky when they don't have much on them, they can go for around 500 to 700, and that's a steal. All in all, it's a great melee background that I've even used for a successful throwing build once, because they can sometimes have high ranged attack, but don't expect their ranged attack to be useful for anything other than throwing, because they don't get many masteries. They're purely, or 99% of the time, purely a melee-driven build, and you will be happy with what you get as long as you get the stars and all that jazz. Definitely outperforms almost every time. The Milkmaid and the Milkman are next, and I'll do them together. They are C tiers. They are, weirdly enough, very similar to the Miller. No, wait. They are less than average melee stats, but they are similar to the Miller, so we'll do the Miller at the same time. That's right. They have very high fatigue and very high HP, but they don't really have anything else going for them. So the Milkman, the Milkmaid, and the Miller are very, very similar and almost undifferentiated in stats. But I guess the only time you'd really want to pick these guys up, if they get a cheap price on them, which they usually do, they're usually pretty cheap, is because of that high HP and the high fatigue, where you can build a rotating savior brother. So a brother that only has a job to wear a bunch of armor, a nice shield, and rotate all out your other brothers that are dying or struggling. So as like a savior type brother. Other than that, I really don't recommend grabbing them because you need too much luck for their melee attack and melee defense to be good. The Miner is definitely B tier. Has very high HP as a background, but also has horrible fatigue. So very polarized in that way. So don't expect a brother to have very high fatigue usage. Don't use them as a miner. Their melee attack stat is pretty decent, and with luck it can be even stronger. The defenses aren't always amazing, but all in all, it's pretty decent price. You get them for about 300-400-ish. For a two-handed melee background is usually what I build them as, because a low fatigue with a high HP allows you to walk around and just hit people once a turn. You get a good boon with them by having a 10% movement speed on hills and a 7.5% movement speed on mountains. I'm usually happy when I grab a miner. If I get unlucky, I don't usually mind as well because they're nice and cheap. So definitely a very solid B tier for definitely a solid price. So I do recommend miners. Now, I go into a bit of controversy with the minstrel. I do not support minstrels and I don't like them. I don't believe they're able to provide much help to a battle or to a team. In terms of stats, they're C tier. And in terms of usefulness, I believe they're C tier as well. If you're relying on your entire team for a minstrel to constantly give you fatigue or healing every turn, then you're relying too much on a minstrel. I think each brother should be able to hold their own. But a minstrel can support a team nicely. I'm not discounting that. Having a little bit of extra fatigue every now and again, or a little bit of health every now and again, depending on the situation, is nice to have a minstrel on your team. But I can't say they're super useful. They have pretty bad health and fatigue, though, which they kind of need because they're constantly singing all the time. The resolve is a bit luck-based, but they can roll pretty high resolve if you're lucky. They have a bit of range defense like the Gambler to stay alive in the background whilst they're constantly pumping out a guitar solo. They're not my cup of tea. I don't like relying on them, but in the right circumstances, they can help complement a party. But something I usually grab later on. I try and hunt for more useful backgrounds than a minstrel. But yeah, C tier for sure. The monk is next. It is a more reliable source of resolve, and it is B tier. Just like the Gambler and the Cultist, the monk is a good choice to go for a banner build, or, yeah, just banner build, basically. You can get a couple of supporting abilities like the minstrel with the monk, but you're not really looking for a combat brother if you're going for a monk or a minstrel. The monk does suffer most of the time with weaker attack and weaker defenses. So you're mainly going for that nice resolve and maybe even those prayers. More often than not, you're going to roll bad on the stats needed for combat, but at least it's cheap, and I don't mind picking one up for hunting for a banner. Definitely a good choice for banner hunting. Next up is the Muladi, is B tier. That is another southern background added to our list, and sadly, it's not amazing. It's just good. It's a little bit rare sometimes, so you're going to have a bit of trouble finding one in the southern lands. You got to get a bit lucky. It takes the benefits of a poacher and a houndmaster and puts that into one person. So if you like poachers and you like houndmasters, but you don't like having two people do the same job, two people doing their jobs and one person do the same job, go with the Muladi. Basically, with a bit of luck, it can make a really nice hybrid background, hybrid build. I still think the Beast Slayer does a little bit better in that job, but depending on what you need on your team, the Muladi can fit most of your combat roles, especially with a bit of luck. I personally see it better in the ranged role. I don't like using the Muladi as a melee because it's a little bit more unreliable, but I just don't really recommend the purchase because you can spend your money on better brothers for the same price. They can be a little expensive as well. So, I mean, Fletchers and Bowyers are probably perform better in ranged. And you probably get a Brawler or a Butcher or a Miner or something performing better in melee with a bit of luck. So, if you like hybrids, maybe go for it. But in my general opinion, just maybe not. Next up is our another Crisis build, another Crisis background. The Noble. A tier for sure. As long as you overlook the rough state of drunkenness that the Noble joins your party in, during the Noble Crisis, you will be very happy to grab yourself this background. Super high resolve and melee attack will often allow you to custom build the best mind over body build for any weapon you desire, or even run him as your best banner that can actually fight. So if you're struggling to find a good banner in your entire party, just get the Noble. I mean, if you can. The only reason I can't push him to S tier, because he's great as a Crisis, I can't push him to S tier because if you roll low on his stats, it can really reduce his impactfulness in your party. He is free, he's top of the A tier for sure, but if he rolls low, maybe you're not going to be as happy with having him, but he'll still be good. Like, even if he rolls low, he'll be good, but maybe he won't look as amazing as I'm pitching him to you. So that's that with the Noble. Next up is the Nomad. The Nomad is A tier for sure. Unfortunately, the background Nomad is super expensive. Now, this includes the Nomad ranged and the Nomad melee. Technically, there's two different ones, but in general, they're just way too expensive and probably will not be on your radar, as it's rarely on my radar. Other than the lowish resolve in HP, you'll find yourself with either a reliable ranged or melee brother. That depends on whatever weapon they're wielding, will depend on whatever stats they have. It hardly needs any luck to have good stats for what you're looking for, but their price is just usually what steers me away. If I want a good melee, I'll just hunt for a militia. If I want a good ranged, I'll hunt for a hunter. There's no real need for me to go hunting for a nomad in any situation of the game. So for my money, I'll just grab something else. The only unique thing about the nomad is if you love the desert environment and you love traveling the desert and you hate being caught by enemies in the desert, the nomad gives you 10% movement speed on all desert associated terrain, like Oasis, like the desert. So if you love being around there and you like being super fast, grab a couple nomads, but you're going to pay through the roof way too many times for just that little benefit. But that's about that of the nomad. Next up is the Nun. The Nun is B tier. It's the female version of the monk in almost every single way. You get the same events and everything. It's almost identical in stats. The thing with the monk is it's usually a little bit more expensive, and the Nun is usually cheaper. But it can be a bit rarer. Definitely one to roll on if you need a banner support. If you like monks, go for nuns because they're cheaper. But all in all, just a good pickup. But not good in combat, just like the monk. Not good in combat. The Peddler is recently had its price drastically reduced from a couple thousand to about 600, which is nice to see. But unfortunately, its stats are still C tier. I personally didn't care much before, and even now with the reduced cost. The Peddler can make some really nice additions to your party in terms of barter percent. So if you love trading, definitely grab Peddlers. If you want to make a giant fortune off of selling goods, selling food, buying food, making food, and also reducing the cost you pay every day for your brothers, the Peddler is the place to go. Just don't expect him to hold himself up in combat. Their stats are rather mediocre, and as usual need so much luck to be even useful in the battlefield. But usually you want to grab one for their barter and their perks. So definitely a thumbs up if you're using them for that purpose. A thumbs down if you want to use them for combat. So that's about that. The Pickpocket is one of the best backgrounds for defense and B tier for me. Now, one of the best backgrounds to defense is, I have to explain that. I keep an eye out for them and check their stats constantly because they're a cheap source of melee defense. They're not the best defense in the game in terms of melee defense, but since they're cheap, you can make a good tank out of them with less money that you're paying for any other gigantic background. So I'll usually roll on a bunch of pickpockets and get a few good defense characters, before I start spending thousands on something higher up. So definitely a background I recommend if you're trying to find a cheaper source of tank. But as usual, you still need a bit of luck. Even if they roll low, they're still a pretty good tank, but luck always helps with the pickpocket. Now next up is the Pimp. C tier. It is mediocre. There's really not any good stats to talk about on the Pimp. They're hard to get because there's an event that's very rare to happen, and you have to have a monk in your team to convert the Pimp to join you, because Pimps don't normally join you unless you have a monk. They're just average. Unless you get really high rolls, as usual. Not really a brother I care about. It's a free body on the field that you get from an event, but yeah, nothing more to say, nothing worth it. The Poacher, A tier. Basically the poor man's weaker hunter. That's all the Poacher is. If you're needing range damage and range skill on a budget, and you can't constantly farm your entire map and get hunters, I'd definitely look to the Poacher. Bowyers and Fletchers are nice, but the Poacher is where it's at. They're cost effective, about 500 bucks is the great way to go for a Poacher. Not much reliance on luck, you're going to get a good one almost every single time. Just go for Poachers for sure. Especially if you don't have the money for a hunter. The Kion is our final southern background, and, in my opinion, is one of the better ones. B tier. The Muladi was a bit too costly for the weird hybrid stats that it gave. The Kion is moderately priced. Sometimes can be a bit expensive, sometimes isn't too bad. And their stats aren't too bad either. They do require a bit of luck, so you're not going to be getting a great one every time. But if you get some high rolls, can be actually quite strong. But because they're moderately priced, if you low roll, you've wasted your money. So, a bit iffy about that. I'd say they're a high C tier, low B tier, as they're the southern equivalent of a minstrel. You are sacrificing a bit of resolve of the minstrel to boost all of your other stats and survivability. But for people who love the minstrel, this is a gigantic boon for you because it is the better minstrel. The Kion will do wonders for your team as a minstrel that does just better healthy stats, will keep yourself alive. Minstrels are too breakable. They're too weak in my opinion. And the Kion is just better. So go for that. Next is the Raider. The Raider is A tier. It's an expensive background that definitely performs well in melee if you have the coin. Doesn't need much luck because it's just in general, even the low stats are really good. But you can get really low resolve and HP rolls, which can make you a bit less helpful in the front line and a bit more risky to put them in the front line. They're not big ones on my radar because they're pricey to get a Raider. But it's still a strong background to add to any party if you have the coin. Next up is the Ranger. This is the crisis for the Greenskin Crisis. This is the event that you get, and you get yourself a Ranger joining your party. It is A tier. Basically, it's a Poacher that you get for free. So Poachers are A tier, Rangers are A tier. Some people really, really love the Ranger because you get a couple of cool new perks. You get good monster slaying perks, which I do recommend grabbing the monster slaying perks on the Ranger because they are actually pretty good. They're free, and because those perks don't come normally on other backgrounds, they're nice to have on your team. Hunters are definitely better than Rangers in terms of stats, but if you're hunting monsters, Rangers can put up a good fight as well. They're almost S tier, but if you do get really low rolls on the Ranger, they can, like the Noble, just not feel as impactful on your team. It's really cool that they also increase your ammo stash by 55, just like the Master Archer. Excuse me. So definitely a nice free brother that can help a heavily ranged party. So they're very nice to grab. Next up is the Ratcatcher. The Ratcatcher is definitely a nice background. B tier for sure. It has practically the highest initiative out of any background, even better than the assassins. The only downfall is the reliance on some luck for the rest of the melee stats to fall together. That's why the assassin will outperform the ratcatcher in general, because in general they've got higher stats averaged. Where the ratcatcher can roll really well, but can also roll a little low. They are also very cheap, so I like rolling through ratcatchers. It's very nice to try and build a dodge build or a fencer build. If you don't have the time to wait for the luck to happen to get a good ratcatcher, and you have the money, just go for the assassins instead. But I like spending all my cheap money on ratcatchers to search through them and find a good one. Next up is the Refugee. D tier, only when you're desperate, just horrible stats. If you get max rolls on everything, maybe they're like a C tier, but just ignore them. Refugees are not worth it. Just bad stats. They're cheap, but just bad stats. The Retired Soldier is B tier. I do have to scroll down here, don't I? There we go. The Retired Soldier is fitting right near the Deserter. Basically, it's the same idea as the Deserter. The Deserter has low resolve, absolutely low resolve, but good melee stats in general. The Retired Soldier has good melee stats in general, with not low resolve, but has low health. So the Deserter will flee in battle, have constant bad morale checks. The Retired Soldier will probably get sniped really easily and take a couple of bad hits and die instantly. So that's why they're two really good backgrounds, but they survive if you can deal with their negatives. And you deal with the Deserter's negative by not putting him on the front line. And you deal with the Retired Soldier's negative by getting Colossus and stuff like that. But I will actually have to pump this one up to the A tier. I believe the Retired Soldier can outperform the Deserter because Colossus is just so good. You can also grab Resilient, which gives you +6 health. There's just more perks to deal with low health than there is to deal with low resolve. And I think, and I believe, that the Retired Soldier can perform better in just general situations, as long as you have the perks. That's the thing. If you can't find Colossus or Resilient, you just don't go for a Retired Soldier. But the fact that they can roll on those perks to fix their problem, for just a decent price, like $1,000, $2,000, you can get a very strong background that only needs 2 perks to fix its problem. In all honesty, you can go for Hedge Knights and other things that don't have problems, but you're going to be paying a bit more. I'd still go for Manhunters because I love Manhunters, but don't outcount the Retired Soldier. They're actually pretty good if you can deal with their low health. But yeah, that's my take on them. Now, we're moving up to the Seamstress. We're almost running out. We're almost by the end of this. The Seamstress is next, and it is C tier. Seamstress is just the slightly weaker version of the Tailor, which we will get to in a bit. There's nothing special going for it. Very mediocre stats with only very high rolls making a difference, as usual for most of the C tiers. The only good thing about a Seamstress is you're a gateway to getting late game crafting, in terms of cloaks and stuff. But just grab a Tailor instead if you want to do late game crafting. Seamstresses are not as good. Sellswords are A tier. Just good stats. But by the name, it implies they're expensive, and they are. It's basically, the Sellsword is the better version of the Retired Soldier that doesn't have a health problem, but you're paying more for not having a health problem. So that's it. As long as you have the coin, go for things like this. If you don't have the coin, play around with other backgrounds that maybe need a little bit of help. But Sellswords are definitely top of the A tier. Such a good background that can even do well in range sometimes if you're lucky. But most of the time you just want them as a good melee background. Costly, upfront, and per day. The Servant is next, and C tier. Another basic background with mediocre stats that only becomes useful at max rolls. I sound like a broken record. That's just basically all the C tiers. Though the good thing about the servant is they're very cheap usually. They can get the cooking perk, so they're like the butcher, cheaper version. And they're not the greatest in combat, but if you want the cooking perk just to unlock the retinue, the cook, for the level 3, you can have a servant sit in your back line, get to level 3, and then sell them. So that's a nice, cheap, easy way of getting that done. But other than that, there's not much usefulness for a servant. Next up is the Shepherd. Shepherd is A tier for sure. Absolutely beautiful. The Shepherd is a slightly less reliable version of the Poacher, but in my opinion, they're a little bit better. Because even if you roll low on Shepherds, they always come with the Slinger Spins perk, which gives them plus 12 in their range stat, which means they'll always have good range stats. It doesn't matter what you do with a Shepherd, they will always have good range stats if you go for slings. If you're getting Shepherds for their stats to go with a different weapon, then maybe they're just a little bit worse than a Poacher. So, yeah. They're also pretty cheap if you get lucky. They can be about 500-ish, so close to a Poacher. But sometimes they can be expensive, close to 1,000, so maybe go for the cheaper ones, depending on what they're equipped with. But they do come equipped with Nomad Slings as well sometimes, which is a really strong weapon, so sometimes the extra price is worth it because you're getting a free equipped weapon on top of it. Okay, next, coming to technically the best background in the entire game. You guessed it, it is the Shield Maiden. Hands down the most overpowered, most valuable background in the entire Legends mod selection. It is top of the list for me as well. Nowhere will you find a background at such a reasonable $1,000 to $2,000 price that provides the best and most reliable melee defense stat in the entire game. Hedge Knights don't even come close. Holy Knights, Holy Crusaders, nowhere near. Defensible Pickpockets, not even close. Foot Soldiers, which is technically one of the closest to Shield Maidens, still doesn't even come close. Shield Maiden's melee defense is just through the freaking roof. Absolutely amazing. Even on the lowest rolls of a Shield Maiden, you will have a dominating tank. Just grab your stars and you'll be happy every single time. All of the base stats for a Shield Maiden in terms of melee are good as well. You can sometimes roll really well and have a dominating melee attack brother with a Shield Maiden, but I recommend you just ignore that and just go for the tank. Tanks are hard to build in this game. Just use the Shield Maiden as a tank, even if it has strong melee attack. I just recommend utilizing it for what it's got and for the amazing defense stat that it has. But yeah, just focus on the defense in my opinion. They're completely unstoppable. Next up is the Squire. B tier. The Squire is a rather good background, but I'm always put off by the cost. You don't need much luck to find a good Squire, because they have good melee attack and good melee defense in general. Sometimes they can roll low on HP, but they're just the price. It's not worth it. They're not cost effective in my opinion. Go for miners, go for brawlers, go for anything else in the B tier. You're spending like 1,000, 2,000 plus bucks on Squires, and they're just not gonna perform for the price that you're spending them. So yeah, I really can't recommend them. Next up is this Swordmaster, the vanilla king of damage. A tier. I don't actually think Swordmasters are S tier. Their attack is one of the strongest in the entire game. One of the highest melee attack stat available. They're an expensive, jacked up sellsword, jacked up retired soldier, sorry. They have low health, just like the retired soldier. They've got better attack, better defense. They're basically just retired soldier 2.0. And with that, they also carry the detriments of the retired soldier. Their health is horrible. The other worst thing is they get old age. Eventually, when a Swordmaster gets past level 9, they will have negative 10% to almost all their stats. And you can only cure one of those every game because you get the water skin. But, I mean, you're building a glass cannon. If you love swordsmen, swordmasters, you're spending a lot of money on a glass cannon. And, I mean, you can still go for things like Colossus and Resilient like you do with the Retired Soldier. But, I mean, for that crazy amount of money, just cycle through another bunch of characters that are better. Or just can do it maybe slightly less attack, but maybe will survive a bit longer. And won't cost you as much per day. But yeah, the Swordmaster, it's not something I go for. I don't like them because they're too expensive and they're too glass cannony. But if you don't mind playing with a glass cannon, go for it. And if you don't have, if you have the coin as well. The Tailor, C tier. We did mention that the Tailor is the slightly better version of the Seamstress. I've gotten lucky with a Tailor before and had a good defender with them. But as usual, you can get lucky with any of the C tiers. They're just mediocre stats, and they are cheap as well, so they're just like the Seamstress, but just the better choice. Don't cycle through too many of them for stats, because they're probably not going to be worth it too much. But my godlike Tailor back in the day had Paranoid and Sure-Footed, which made him amazing in defense, but that can happen to any other brother in the game, so don't bank on them being useful. Better off with any other C tier. For combat, at least. But for crafting, you gotta grab one. Next up is our Taxidermist. Taxidermist is B rank. Taxidermists are, weirdly enough, good combat brothers. They're really good in melee. And not just because they have the potential to be good on the back ranks. Like, they've got 100% crafting speed in camping, and they're just useful for that reason. But the combat ability is just good melee stats. They can roll a bit low, as always, with most brothers, and their defense isn't amazing, but they're actually pretty cheap, and I will always go for a taxidermist over any C tier. Like, these C tiers are not as good as taxidermists. And sometimes taxidermists can compete with B tiers as well in terms of stats. So a very cheap way of getting good stats. Don't forget about the taxidermist, I must say. Next up is the Thief, B tier. I believe the Thief is in a similar ballpark to the Pickpocket. They can be a cheap source of melee defense, though the Pickpocket is a little bit better at melee defense. The Thief is a teeny-weensy bit better at range defense, I think. That's what the difference between those two are. But if you get some good rolls, the Thief can actually be a pretty good tank too. So I love rolling on Pickpockets, but I also do love rolling on Thieves for some nice defense. As long as I get a 3-star in melee defense, I'm trying these two out for sure. And I will be happy most of the time. So definitely ways to go for tanks are these two backgrounds indeed. Next up is the Troubadour, D tier. The Troubadour is the rare female version of the Minstrel, and we already know my opinions on the Minstrel, and how his stats are actually pretty bad too. Weirdly enough, the Troubadour has even worse stats. I know how I say that female and male components are usually pretty similar, and they usually are, but the Troubadour is just worse. In almost every category, except ranged attack, which is kind of useless anyways, the Troubadour's just got worse stats than the Minstrel. And the Minstrel's got worse stats than Keon. So if you love these guys, just go Keon. Yeah, just grab the Keon. Okay, so we're down to the last few. Vagabond, D tier. Just another weak melee background. It's got decent HP and fatigue, so you can watch it fail in every other category. That's basically what it's there for. I would pick the Vagabond over other D tiers if you want a body on the field that might be able to survive an extra hit. But even then, spend your money on something else. Just don't. Don't buy a Vagabond. Next up is the Vala, the event background that is coveted by almost everybody who plays this game. S tier. Now, I'm doing this slightly wrong because the Vala's stats are garbage. Absolute garbage. They're just mediocre at best. You're not going to have a Vala in combat bashing anyone's head, stopping any arrows, doing anything useful at all. Most of the time, you're going to be having her sitting in the back, trying to stay alive. The reason why the Vala is always exceptional and strong S tier is because of her ability to allow you to craft runes whilst camping. Instead of rolling luckily on enemies by getting their drop tables and saying, oh no, I fought a bunch of Alps and I didn't get a rune, you can have a Vala in your party that just crafts them for you. So make sure you keep her alive because her stats aren't great. Make sure you're able to have someone in your party that can just, be kept safe. She does get the ability to summon a ghost friend that goes around and attacks things for you. It has been bugged in the past, but I think they fixed it. It's pretty cool to have him around because that actually makes her combat ability a little bit better. So she has an expendable guy that does damage. But don't expect much combat ability from the Vala, but expect amazing help with the runes that she can help craft for your party. And that's why she shines as an S tier for that reason, not combat or stats. Okay, moving on, we have our next S tier, the Warrior. The Warrior is an absolute beast. It's basically a retired soldier with better fatigue, melee defense, and good HP. It's a win-win situation for practically the same price. You're spending 2 grand on the Warrior, 2 grand on the Foot Soldier, 2 grand on the Albalester. But out of all three, technically the Warrior's the weakest of the three. So if you grab a Foot Soldier and Arbalester, they'll do a better job than the Warrior. You're asking what is the catch? As usual, they are super rare. And you'll only find them in like citadels and strongholds and all that. Super rare. At least they're good with low rolls, though. Warriors, even though they are the weaker version of the three, they still are good on low rolls. Their defense isn't as good as the Foot Soldier, and the Arbalist has better attack in ranged. The Warrior you don't want to use as ranged, but their melee attack is pretty good. Nothing crazy like a Swordmaster, but they're still really good in melee attack. So S tier for sure. Next up is the Washerwoman. C tier. A mediocre background that needs lots of rolls to be normal and useful. Don't hold your breath, but the best part about the Washerwoman is she's cheap, and definitely a better choice than the D tiers for a body on the field. So if you're wanting someone on the field, just get someone from the C tiers. Washerwoman's good just to sit there. Apprentice, Servant's not good to sit on the field, but you'd want things like Gravedigger, Fishmonger, Washerwoman. Just average stats sitting on your field. But yeah. The next up, we'll do them together, is the Widow and the Widower. So the Widow and the Widower, D tier. Technically the melee attack isn't too bad on occasion, but the rest of the package just fails this background. Never worth it to grab these guys in my opinion. Their stats are just not good. Not good at all. And because they're weak in health as well, they're just going to die really easy, just like most of the other D tiers, if you ever put them up against enemies that will hit back. Next up is the Wildman. Wildman is B tier. Absolute unit of a background, but don't put it on the front lines. And because of this reason, I don't like using the Wildman too often. Also because of the price. The Wildman's defenses are just garbage. You've got great HP, great fatigue, and great resolve to focus on surviving in the back lines, whilst you coast on negative defenses forever. You're going to have pretty decent melee attack, but I don't recommend grabbing it because the price is a bit too high, and it might not even get polearm mastery or any weapon specs that allows you to have reach. So you might just roll on a Wildman that is just completely useless for you. You still need some rolls on melee attack to be useful, but don't use them for range. They're absolutely useless. Now, next up is the Wildwoman, which is similar to the Wildman, but is not exactly the same. They're a bit rarer to find. They're the female version of the Wildman. Comes with even less defense. If you thought the Wildman had bad defenses, sheesh, welcome to the Wildwoman. Even worse defenses, but they do get a bit more fatigue, which is nice. Technically, in my opinion, if you're ignoring defenses, which you should, the Wildwoman is better than the Wildman, and probably the better choice out of the two when you're trying to build somebody for your back ranks. Interestingly enough, both the Wildwoman and the Wildman have a 100% bonus to gathering medicine, which is nice to have on the side whilst you're camping. But as usual, they're both just a little too expensive for me in terms of stats for cost effectiveness, and I don't usually get one when they're available to me. Well, last but not least on our list is the Witch Hunter. And the Witch Hunter is our final B tier for today. I believe they have quite solid stats, one of the best backgrounds to make a hybrid build off of. So if you're a lover of hybrids, the Witch Hunter is pretty much going to be there for you almost every time. Though, more often than not, I, myself, will roll low with their stats and be disappointed with how much money I sunk into a jack-of-all-trades and a master of none, because I am not the biggest lover of hybrid builds, and they don't do one job amazingly, and yeah, there's just, if you want a ranged character, go a hunter. If you want melee, go with other things. For about $1,000, though, you can justify the cost if they do well for your hybrids, which they usually do. Their defenses, sadly, that's the one thing I wish witch hunters had better, is defenses. You'd think people that kill witches for a living would be able to keep themselves alive. But because they have slightly low defenses, even if you get the stars in them, they're usually not worth it. You have to keep them in your back lines, which is where you normally would keep your hybrids. Well, usually. But yeah, their price and the luck needed, I'd just go for a militia in melee and a hunter in ranged over a witch hunter. But that's that. Well, that's pretty much it for the tier list. I really hope this was able to give you a general overview of the stats and the capabilities for the backgrounds currently available to hire in Legends mod. For more detailed stats and information, please check out my spreadsheet. That will be linked in the description. I've put a ton of effort into it, and I hope it can help make your playthroughs of the Legends mod more fun by making it easier when hiring new brothers. I know it's helped many people in the past, and it still helps people today, so please go check it out. The tier list will also be added to the spreadsheet so you can look it up whenever you want. In the end, though, did the backgrounds you like get put where you thought they'd be? Did you expect to see more E tiers? Or did you expect to see more S tiers? Or do you just love the minstrel more than I do? Feel free to comment and ask questions, and I'll be happy to help and respond. But that's basically everything for me, so I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll catch you in the next one. See yous!